Welcome to today's Authors at Google's talk. I have the pleasure of introducing today's guest, who is a prize-winning journalist, best-selling novelist, and prolific writer of contemporary Jewish nonfiction. She has authored 3 best-selling novels, including The Red Tint, Good Harbor, and The Last Days of Dogtown. On a more personal note, she is my fellow WashU alum and your Massachusetts neighbor. She is here today to speak with us about her most recent work, Day After Night. We're in for a real treat. Please welcome Anita Diamant.
Hi, thanks for taking time out of your day, or I guess you want to thank me for the legitimate opportunity to play hooky. Although I always think of Google as not a place anybody wants to play hooky from, right? So, as a consumer and user of Google, I feel like, I belong here somehow. I think everybody who Googles as a verb. I mean, my 84-year-old mother knows what Google is a verb, and when that happened, I knew the world had changed forever. So. And it's also nice to be here in Massachusetts. I got to visit the New york mothership, although that's not the mothership, is it, actually? But the New York office, which took a half an hour to just walk through it. So,
Yeah.
So it's great to be here, and I'm going to talk to you about my most recent novel, which was published in September. I'm going to talk about how I came to write it, a little bit about the research. I'll read just a short passage, and then hopefully we can do more of a conversation with a Q&A. I'm not sure anybody, has anybody read this yet? I know one person, and she's not. Yeah. So, okay. So I won't assume anything. No spoilers. No spoilers. I wrote this book, the way I came to find out about the story that this novel tells is that my daughter, who was spending a semester in Israel when she was 15 years old on a high school program, she lived in Jerusalem, and she studied math and English and social studies and everything else, as she would at high school here in Newton. But she also did a semester course on the history of Israel, from prehistory through modern times. So my husband and I went on the parents' trip, which was our first trip to Israel. This was 2001. It was 2001. And we followed them around on their field trips, basically, for a week. We got on and off the bus. We went with them to all over the state of Israel. By the time we got there, they were studying the founding of the state of Israel, so we were in the 1940s by then, late 1940s, and a little before that, end of World War II, prehistory, then the founding of the state. So we got on and off the bus in Tel Aviv, where there had been a big rally when the announcement came that the United Nations had acknowledged the state of Israel as a real state. And we were in prisons, and we were in battlefields. And at one point we got off the bus in a place called Atlit, which nobody had ever heard of, sort of in the middle of nowhere, a couple of miles south of Haifa, which is a beautiful coast city. And it's actually Boston's sister city. It looks more like San Francisco than Boston. It's very hilly, but it's an ocean seaside town. So we got out, and we found ourselves in what was essentially a prison. It looked like a prison camp. It was a very bare bones kind of place. It's a place that kids go a lot, and Israeli kids go to learn this particular chapter in Israeli history. It's a little bit like Old Sturbridge Village, or Plymouth Plantation, or Williamsburg, if you've been to any of those places, except there's no snack bar, there's no restaurant, there's barely a bathroom. It was very, very basic. And it had been in service, and the reason we were there was that in the 1940s, the British, who had the mandate in Palestine, they were given by the United Nations, to administer Palestine, were in charge. And there was a quota on the number of Jewish immigrants allowed into the land. And when people broke the law and came in without the requisite papers, they were thrown in this prison in Atlit. And in 1944, 1945, right after World War II, immigrants from Europe, immigrants from the Holocaust, survivors, got to the land of Israel. The British nabbed them off the boats and threw them into Atlit, which is a place surrounded by barbed wire fences. So to go from some of these people who've been survivors in concentration camps to get thrown into what looked like, from the outside anyway, another concentration camp was profoundly traumatic and frightening. Once they got inside, they learned pretty quickly that they weren't going to be killed, that they were going to be fed, and that they were, in fact, members of the Jewish community who lived in Palestine, called the Yishuv, who were there volunteering and working with the local authorities to connect them if they had family members in the land, to make sure that they had medical attention and food. But it was a kind of a weird limbo place. So we got off the bus, we learned all of this little chapter of Israeli history, American history, Jewish history, world history, that certainly nobody on our bus had ever heard about. And we had this terrific guide, who was also the principal of my daughter's program. And he told us this story about how in 1945, in October of 1945, the Palmach, which was the fighting arm of the Jewish community there, broke everybody out of the camp because they were threatening to send people back to Iraq in particular, where they would have been killed. And they rescued 200 people, marched them up the mountains, and got away with it. It's a very dramatic rescue, which Yitzhak Rabin was part of, who was the past prime minister of Israel. So it was a great story, and I'm sitting there thinking to myself, what a great novel. And that was in 2000. But I really was not in a big rush to write this novel because I knew it was going to be heavy. I mean, it takes me about 3 years from the beginning of starting to do serious research and writing and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting until the book comes out. 3 years, to spend 3 years really thinking about the Holocaust, thinking about what life must have been like for people after the war, trying to find a new life in a new place where everything was unfamiliar to them, the land, the climate, everybody around them, people who were traumatized in a million different ways. So I wrote 3 other novels, or books, including 2 novels and a nonfiction book. But this story was sort of sitting at the back of my shoulder and tapping me, and I didn't want anyone else to get to it before I did. So there's that element. So about 4 years ago, I wrote a brief proposal, got a contract, and started working on this book. And I went back to Israel a couple of times, interviewed people there, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. I'm going to read you the prologue and ask you not to follow along in your books. Go back to being a little kid on your parents' lap, which is how everybody, I think, who loves books and reading learns to love books and reading. So it's very short, it's only 3 pages. So this is the prologue to Day After Night. 1945, August. The nightmares made their rounds hours ago. The tossing and whimpering are over. Even the insomniacs have settled down. The 20 restless bodies rest, and faces aged by grief, hunger, and doubt relax to reveal the beauty and the pity of their youth. Not one of the women in Barrack C is 21, but all of them are orphans. Their cheeks press against small military-issue pillows that smell of disinfectant. Lumpy and flat from long service under heavier heads, they bear no resemblance to the goose-down clouds that many of them enjoyed in childhood. And yet, the girls burrow into them with perfect contentment, embracing them like teddy bears. There were no pillows for them in the other barracks. No one gives a pillow to an animal. The British built Atlit in 1938 to house their own troops. It was one in a group of bases, garages, and storage units on the coastal plain a few miles south of Haifa. But at the end of the World War, as European Jews began making their way to the ancestral homeland in violation of international political agreements, the mandate in Palestine became messier, which is how it came to pass that Atlit was turned into a prison, or in the language of command, a detention center for refugees without permissory papers. The English arrested thousands as illegal immigrants, sent most of them to Atlit, but quickly set them free, like fish too small to fry. It was a perfectly forgettable compound composed of wooden barracks and buildings set out in rows on a scant square acre, surrounded by weeds and potato fields. But the place offered a grim welcome to the exhausted remnant of the final solution, who could barely see past those barbed wire fences. 3 of them, in fact, concentric lines that scrawled a crabbed and painful hieroglyphic across the sky. Not half a mile to the west of Atlit, the Mediterranean breaks against a rocky shore. And when the surf is high, you can hear the stones hiss and sigh in the tidal wash. On the eastern horizon, the foothills of the Carmel reach heavenward, in keeping with their name, Kerem El, the vineyard of God. Sometimes the candles of a village are visible in the high distance, but not at this hour. The night is too old for that. It is cool in the mountains, but hot and damp in Atlit. The overhead lights throb and buzz in the moist air, heavy as a blanket. Nothing moves. Even the sentries in the guard towers are snoring, lulled by the stillness and sapped like their prisoners by the cumulative weight of the heat. There are no politics in the waning hour of the night, no regret, no delay, no waiting. All of that will return with the sun, and the waiting is worse than the heat. Everyone who's locked up in Atlit waits for an answer to the same questions. When will I get out of here? When will the past be over? There are only 170 inmates in Atlit tonight, and fewer than 70 women in all. It's the same lopsided ratio on the chaotic roads of Poland and Germany, France and Italy. The same in the train stations and the displaced persons camps, in queues for water, identification cards, shoes, information. The same quotient, too, in the creaking, leaky boats that secretly ferry survivors into Palestine. There is no mystery to this arithmetic. According to Nazi calculation, males produced more value alive than dead, if only marginally, if only temporarily, so they killed the women faster. In Barrack C, the corrugated roof releases the last degree of yesterday's sun, warming the blouses and skirts that hang like ghosts from the rafters. There are burlap sacks suspended there as well, lumpy with random rescued treasures. Photograph albums, books, candlesticks, wooden bowls, broken toys, tablecloths, precious debris. The narrow cots are lined up unevenly against the naked wood walls. The floor is littered with thin wool blankets kicked aside in the heat. A baby crib stands empty in the corner. In Haifa, the lights are burning in the bakeries where the bread rises and the workers pour coffee and light cigarettes. On the kibbutz, among the pine trees high in the Carmel, dairymen are rubbing their eyes, pulling on their boots. In Atlit, the women sleep. Nothing disturbs them. No one notices the soft stirring of a breeze, the blessing of the last and gentlest chapter of this day. It would be a kindness to prolong this peace and let them rest a bit longer, but the darkness is already heavy with the gathering light. The birds have no choice but to announce the dawn. Eyes begin to open. And then we enter the world for good of Atlit, and for young women in particular. In Atlit, what still remains in Atlit, which is, as I said, it's a tourist attraction, it's an education center mostly for Israeli kids, but also Americans who are coming through on particular historical tours. And one of the buildings that's still standing, in addition to some of the barracks, is this giant kind of hangar-like place, which was called the Delousing Shed by the inmates, and that's what I call it in the book. And it's an enormous space which scared the living daylights out of people because as they walked towards the front doors, there were these giant machines to steam people's clothes to get the lice off of them, and they were exactly the same make and model as the machines in some of the concentration camps. So people who had been through that saw this and fainted and screamed and thought they were going to be killed. And no matter how much reassurance people could give them, there was this tremendous dissonance between what they were seeing and remembering and then what they were being told, even by people who spoke in their own language and were trying to reassure them. But in this big space now, where you can still see the showers where people were sent to take showers, they were full of lice and they were filthy after being most of them had come over on boats and crowded, ancient, creaking, leaky boats. So they had to be cleaned and deloused and given new clothes. But right now, this is also still, it's a giant empty space with pictures all over the walls from the early days, from the 1940s, from 1944, 45, 46. And there are pictures of a lot of young men with their shirts off, with their arms around each other, dancing and bunging for the cameras. Very hot in this place, especially the summer. And there are fewer girls, as I mentioned in this prologue. And some of the women were, the pictures of women are like sort of standing like this with their faces very closed. They're not mugging for the camera. And I was really intrigued by what those stories were like. So my book tells the story in particular of 4 women from 4 very different experiences, only one of whom was a concentration camp survivor. The others were in hiding. One of them was actually a partisan fighter. And what their experiences were like during the war. So it's from 4 very different directions, because there is not just one Holocaust story, there is not just one arrival in Israel story, there are multiple stories. And over the course of this, of actually only a summer, it starts in August, it ends in October, these 4 women become friends in a kind of way, become family to each other in a kind of way, because they are all essentially orphans. So they're forced to learn one another's language pretty quickly, and make alliances in order to sort of come back to life after the horrors that they had been through in Europe. I'm going to stop and invite questions, and I can keep talking for a long time, but I'd much rather interact with you. Yeah.
I'd love to hear more about how you did the character research.
Character research?
Yeah.
Yeah, I never knew how to answer that, because I knew pretty early on that I didn't want just one protagonist. I wanted to tell it from multiple points of view, because I know that even in my own family, the people who had been through the experiences of the war, their temperament, their family constellation, and fate and luck, just people react differently. So some people are horribly bitter for the rest of their lives, and some people become remarkably forgiving. And why? Why does that happen? So I was sort of curious to explore that. So there are 4 characters from different countries, from different kind of socioeconomic backgrounds. And so once I sort of set them up, and what was really important to me was to come up with their names and locate where they were from, and then I sort of started to imagine and invent who they are. And in my process, as I write, I get to know them, and then as I revise, I really get to know them. So one of the characters, Teddy, her name came to me, Teddy Pastore, who grew up in Amsterdam, came to me very early on. Some of the other characters' names changed like a year into it, and then they sort of settled, and it was like, that's the right name. Names are really hard and really important. So I did research about the Jewish community in Amsterdam, so I got a little bit of background in addition to what everybody knows about Anne Frank. So I did a lot of reading, and I also interviewed people, a handful of people, who had been in Atlit as very young, like teenagers, like 14, 15 years old, who had come over after the war and are now in their 70s, remembering back. I hired somebody who translated a bunch of very, very short kind of remembrances of what it had been like in Atlit, and then to move forward. One of the really interesting things that I learned doing the research for this book is that nobody talked about the Holocaust until about 1965 during the Eichmann trials, which were broadcast internationally. Eichmann was one of the architects of the final solution of the slaughter of so many millions of people in Europe, and it was broadcast internationally and sort of opened the floodgates. And people who'd been through those years in Europe started to talk and be interviewed, and people started to ask questions. But until then, there was this real reluctance to talk about it. There was a tremendous amount of guilt and shame. Why did I survive? Why did my sister not survive? And then for people who hadn't been there, why didn't I do more? Why didn't I stop this from happening? How could this have happened? So there was sort of this conspiracy of silence around all this. So until pretty recently, the people who'd been through this, people who'd landed in Atlit, they weren't so keen to talk about their experiences. So by the time they started to do oral histories and stuff like that, a lot of them had died, and some of them also had forgotten a lot, or just didn't want to talk about it anymore. So that was a challenge.
I would be an aspiring writer if Google didn't work me so hard. Sidebar. So I'm curious about your process when you write. Do you start with just like a theme and then you build out into an outline, or do you just sort of start writing and see where that story goes organically from there?
Yes. Now I usually, when I've written 3 novels, I'm about to start a 4th one, and I still feel like very much a journeyman. I sort of learn how to do it again every single time I write. I was a nonfiction writer for many, many years. I'm pretty comfortable with that. I know how to do that. Fiction's always, what am I doing? But I usually have a beginning and an ending, sort of the parenthesis of the story. I kind of know where it's going. That doesn't mean I know exactly what it's going to look like. Every single time I've tried, I know where I'm starting from. I have some kind of a plot line, which also might change along the way, but there's this in the beginning and the end line and a deadline. Having been a journalist for a long time, I don't know how anybody does this without that kind of training that you have to meet your deadlines, because people, work on novels for 20 years and they never finish them, but that would drive me crazy. So I know that much. I sometimes know about the main characters a little bit. So once I decided on these 4 characters, there's a bunch of other people who are important in the book as well, who sometimes they develop more into become major minor characters, sometimes they fade away completely. And then I start doing research. I mean, even in the contemporary novel that I wrote, I had to do a lot of research, and that feeds the writing a lot for me, because the more I learn about any given period of history or the climate or the food, I'm very interested in the tactile stuff of what people are eating and wearing, and how life is organized, and how old are you when you get married, and how many kids do people generally have. All of that kind of helps me give shape to what I'm doing. So I do research while I'm writing, pretty much through the first draft, and although I'll start with a lot of research, but then I'll get started. Otherwise, I can just sort of get seduced by learning more and more about any given period, and nobody really wants to know everything you learn when you're doing research, so you have to leave a lot outside of it. So it's hard to write and have a real job at the same time. It's really challenging, and if you're interested in doing it, I think you really need either a writing class or a writing group where other people are waiting to see what you write, because it's really lonely otherwise, and it's very easy to just say, I'm too tired. I have laundry to do, or whatever you need to do.
Do you ever web your characters to create names and
Web them?
with, like, kind of put the images of what the person is to help fill them out as a person?
No, I don't, actually. That's the more organic part of what I do. So they sort of develop as I'm writing them on the page. And then, I have never written a book without a computer. I don't know how people did that beforehand. So it's very easy to go back and revise and, just sort of search and change everybody's name once.
Once you do it, right?
Once you make, so not a blonde, no, and change that back. So, but no, I don't, and I know that's a writing exercise that a lot of people are given, so sort of, here's the character, what does she look like, what's her backstory, who's her father, what did he do, sort of to map out, but I've never taken a creative writing class. I was a journalist for a long time, and I didn't take any journalism classes either, and sort of learned, I had great editors as a journalist, and learned by doing on the job.
What was the most interesting story you heard while interviewing people, or like the kind of most fascinating moment you had throughout the process?
Well, I think they all took place while I was on these very intense little trips when I was there. I had 2 kind of business trips, and I spent an extra day working on the book while I was there. And so one of them, actually, if you read the book, the epilogue of the book it's fictional, but it takes place in the room that I described with a gentleman who looks very much like the person I described, and that was a very powerful experience. And his story doesn't really figure in here, but he was Romanian. He went back and forth during the war and after the war to try to rescue people and bring people from Romania to Palestine to get them out. And he was just a remarkably sweet and strong, and at that point very old and sick at the same time person. So it was really, I felt like I was meeting somebody out of another chapter of history in a lot of ways. So that was very powerful. And I remember also another trip hiking around the mountains, because as I described, Atlit is near the coast, but it's not far up to the mountains. So you actually can walk, and they marched people up the mountains in the dark of the moon. It's just kind of crazy. Women and children without enough shoes and stuff like that. But I went there, and the people who work at Atlit, the director and the oral historian who's collecting material, the historian of the camp. So we didn't walk it. We drove part of the way, we walked part of the way, and we had a picnic. Everyone feeds you a lot there. So I asked them a question, and I had a translator with me too. Some had some English. I have like no Hebrew. So I asked a question about whether it was possible, whether it could have unfolded the way I was imagining it. So they talked to each other back and forth for a good 3 minutes, solidly debating back and forth. And then they turned to me and said, yes. So I remember that very clearly. So they decided I could tell it that way. So the book just came out in Hebrew a couple of weeks ago. It's number 2 on the bestseller list in Israel, so that's very nice. Yeah.
How do you separate yourself emotionally when you're writing about something so heavy, and how do you keep that from really inhibiting your personal life? Because I can imagine that's very difficult to write about it and then go out for dinner or meet friends, or do you not? I mean, does it?
No, I do have a lot.
Flow over.
No, it's yeah, it's. I don't think I was a lot of fun to live with in a lot of ways for the last couple of years, and it was challenging, and there were some days that were really harder than other days, but it's work. You know, it's like I would work and it would spill over, but I can to some extent segregate that part of my work life and my emotional life that way. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but otherwise it would have been impossible. I certainly don't want to do it again. I mean, I certainly don't want to revisit this period. It was hard. It was really hard. So whenever I've had to write, you know, really a violent scene or a really painful scene of loss, it lingers, and that week, especially the week of and since those parts tend to come later in a book, I think I'm ready. Like there's been a warm up before that, so I'm ready for it, and it takes less time to write later. The earlier parts of the book take longer to write. They're just rewritten over and over and over again. By the time I hit halfway through, I sort of know what I'm doing, and I'm writing faster. So I'm not quite living in it quite as intensely. It's really interesting to have these Q&As because sometimes I don't know that until I just said that out loud. I didn't realize that was my process. Yeah.
So how did you move from nonfiction to fiction?
How did I move from nonfiction to fiction? I needed a challenge. I was kind of bored, and so I actually thought about getting a real job, but couldn't do it. I had been self-employed for too long, so I actually did some interviewing and thought, no, I can't work for anyone else. So I thought I would try writing a novel. And no one was waiting for it. I did not get a contract. It was my little hobby, but I also gave myself a deadline because I didn't want to be one of those people who's writing a novel for 15 years. So that was the book of Dina when I was working on it, Turned into the Red Tent. And it was really hard. It was a challenge. I'd never done it before, but I'm somebody who's always read novels. I was an English major and a comp lit major. So reading novels I can't remember a time I didn't read them. So, and I had a very good friend who was an editor who said, well, it does translate. The skills you have as a nonfiction writer many of them anyway, do translate into writing fiction. So, and I'd written a lot of first-person stuff. I'd written columns for the Boston Globe magazine and other national magazines. So I was used to writing in a variety of different styles, and that sort of straight, answering 15 questions. Kinds of stories. I was a feature writer, so I wrote humor as well as really heavy stuff. So I gave it a shot, and I tried to sell it, and I tried to get an agent interested in it, and nobody wanted to see it until it was finished. And then I very, very luckily found somebody who wanted to publish it, and so that's how it was sort of a transition. And it's not like I had this inspiration and I had to do it. It was like I really needed to shake up my writing career, my writing mind. So that's why I started. And if I hadn't been as successful as I was with the first one, I don't know if I would have written another one. I certainly wouldn't have had the option to do pretty much what I wanted to do. I was really very
What sources do you draw from in creating like the personalities of your characters? Do you think it's mostly from the people you interview, or do your characters reflect people you actually know or yourself, or is it just like imagination?
Yes.
All
Yes,
of
all
it?
those things, all those things. I think certainly with this book, these characters, there's a couple of minor characters. There's the cook who's actually from Palestine. She's a local person. She's based very much on reading that I did about what people in Palestine and how they reacted to this flood of immigrants with these horrible stories and tattoos on their arms, and just how do you and so her reluctance to talk to them, to engage with them, was based on things that I learned, and then I sort of gave her a personality around that. The other characters are based on somewhat on people I know, somewhat on books that I read, somewhat on interviews, not just the ones that I did personally, but also pieces of interviews that I read. So it's a real combination of different things. So it's all fodder. For me anyway, fiction and nonfiction, it's all kind of fodder.
So why this specific point in history? Because there's a lot of very interesting, very complicated, very heavy stuff somewhere between, 45 and early 50s, I would say, in the history of Israel as the land and as the state. And I've been on a birthright tour, and they take you to various places that leave a big mark, sort of in different ways. So why that specific place? Why that specific story, if you will?
Well, in large measure, it's because I didn't know it, and I knew that nobody else knew it. Certainly in my world, I think a lot of Israelis know it because it's sort of part of the story, the sort of the triumphalist story of the army, the Palmach, the pre-army. Of a great success. All the inmates got taken out safely, and they got away with it. So there was only one casualty. It was considered a huge success. But my novels in particular always try to tell the stories that are untold, so they tend to focus on women's stories because they tend to be undertold. Not so much in Dogtown, which includes a bigger cast of characters. So, looking at those pictures of the guys mugging and smiling at the camera and the women standing sort of like this and looking not at the camera made me wonder what their experience was like. So there was that. And also the fact that I liked the idea that I could tell a story that nobody had heard before. There are zillions of great stories like that, but this is the one that got thrown into my lap. So it's really very much serendipity, why I write what I write. It's when I stumble across a story that I think, oh, nobody knows this, I didn't know this. And because I didn't know it, it means I'm excited about doing the research to find out more about it. So it's a very narrow view of that year, of that time. Since it's told mostly through these characters, they can't know everything. They don't know all the politics swirling around them. They don't know about the whole military complex building up to fight. And they barely are aware of the presence of the Arab community around them as well. So they're focused on surviving, and they're thrown into this place. And for me, in a way, the book is really about how do you live through unspeakable horror and continue? How do you embrace life? How do you keep going? How do you manage all of that? So, spending a few years thinking about it and writing is one thing, but how do you live through horrible losses? And it's not just limited to the Holocaust. People whose families are wiped out in Haiti. How are those people going to move forward, build families, communities? Start over. How do you start over again? And that was for me a really interesting question that I wanted to explore with these characters.
Were there any points in the 3 years that you were writing this book that you really struggled with a piece of the story and you didn't know which way you wanted to take it?
Well, there were a lot of days I didn't want to do it. So, but no, since I had the arc of the story and they had this rescue and that was going to happen in the book, and that's not giving anything away. The things that there are to be given away are about what happens to the people and what their backstories are. I had that trajectory to move forward. It was just the hard part was was really thinking about what they'd been through and figuring out how each character was going to deal with that in her own way. So those were the sticking points. But unlike in some of the other stuff I've written where I really didn't know which way to turn, I did have this sort of a line. I knew when it was going to end. Although I had a different ending and a different sort of postscript in mind when I was working on it. It didn't work out that way. But by then you trust it.
You're obviously very organized and goal-oriented with deadlines and getting to them and obviously crunching out like 15 or more giant works. But I'm wondering, were there any along the way that fell to the wayside and you've given up on?
No. I have gotten a contract for every book that I've ever written, except for the Richmond. No.
I have never ever failed at anything.
No, I failed a lot. I failed a lot. But the books, it's like it's the job, right? And having written for newspapers and magazines for a long time, if you don't turn in your piece, you don't get paid and you don't get invited back to do it again. So I'm pretty careful about only doing books that I know that I can write, that I have some faith that I can finish in the allotted time. So I wouldn't sign on to do something that I was really, I don't know what I'm getting myself into here. So by the time I've signed a contract, I really have some sense of the beginning and the end, at least some of the characters, and what the point of why am I telling this story? So that's all in place. Now I fail all the time, but not.
And now you mentioned you have a little bit more creative freedom. You can just walk in and say, here's the idea.
Yeah.
Like, great.
Well,
is there more selling you have to do?
Well, I don't just walk in, I have to write something. And my agent walks in and says, do you want this? So we'll see. So far I've been able to do pretty much what I wanted to do. Publishing is in a very weird place right now. Don't know, how many books do you buy in a year? Or how many fat books do you download in a year? So we don't really, it's all up in the air what's going to happen. I think with publishing all print media is trying to figure out, what the next steps are. So, don't know.
So would you be opposed to your books being available on Kindle?
They're all on Kindle. I'm not opposed to them. And I own one, and I read it on airplanes. I don't like it enough I love it on an airplane. I really do. And I feel very cool because people come over and ask you. Still, although it's getting much more common. But the payout is really complicated for writers and publishers. And if you spend 3 years on a book and it's downloaded for $7.99 and you get some tiny fraction of that, it's the economics of publishing are really the business model is really what's up in the air. People are writing more than ever before, but getting paid for your work, for creative work, nobody knows how this is going to shake down. And having been a newspaper writer for a long time too, even more so in journalism.
Do you ever get pushbacks from your editors who will read a couple chapters and want you to take something in a different direction, and how do you deal with that? Do you have to listen to them, or is it, you do have enough clout that you can say, no, this is what I want to do? I have good working relationships with my editors, and my editors, pretty uniformly, including magazines and books, they want to make it a better book. It's not like that they want to change it just for the purpose of, I think I can tell the story better than you can. So when they suggest a change or ask a question about what a character is saying, or where things are going, or the way the time is put together, the storytelling is, and I take it seriously that they're really trying to improve what I'm doing. So I see it as a collaboration. And there are times that I say, no, this is the way I want to go. But generally, especially if you get it from more than one person, you got to take it seriously. If nobody knows what you're talking about here, then it's time to take a look at it. And I sometimes when I see books that are this thick and I start reading them, I think, boy, this person really did not look. Nobody tried to edit, or the writer did not want to hear about editing, and so I think editing is. I like editing. Feels good. If it's a respectful relationship, it's really terrific.
Did
Did you mention that you have another book in the works? And can
I
you share
just, I mean, like yesterday sent, the proposal to my agent who's going to give it to the publisher. So it's it's set on American soil, and it would probably be I'm not going to tell you. It's not really. Soon. I have to. I'm waiting to hear from them. So, but it's not. It's an American story.
So you mentioned that this book was just translated into Hebrew, and
Yeah.
I'm assuming other books of yours have been translated. I've always been really curious, what is the process like to have your work translated into another language, especially if you don't speak it, to like maintain the integrity of what you
There,
written?
it's out of my hands. What happens is the publishers from other countries can buy the rights to translate and sell, and they buy them through. I mean, I will get an email that says, the Croatians want to translate this into Croat. Is that okay? And they're going to give you $1,000. That's about what it is. What am I going to? Great. I mean, and you just keep your fingers crossed and hope that it's a decent translation. I actually met the Israeli woman who translates. She's translated all 4 of my novels now, and she's really lovely. And people tell me she's a good translator. But
So you don't really have that. Typically, they don't email you and they're like, hey, does this?
oh, I do get questions.
Okay.
So really interesting. She emailed me if they don't know what something is. She didn't know what a GI was. And I thought the whole world knew what GIs were, General Enlisted, General Infantry during the war. And but that was not a term that she was familiar with. So soldiers, she knew the soldiers. But so in all of them, it's really fun to get questions like that, and like what is really idiosyncratic to American English in particular. So I don't even know that a British person would know that right now. In the 40s, everybody must have known what a GI was, because it was in newspapers everywhere.
I'm wondering if you draw on your own experiences to develop the emotional content of your characters, and in particular as a mother and a daughter, how you address the kind of orphaned nature of these 4 characters.
Oh, sure. I mean, my emotional life is in here. And I think the emotional life of all my friends and relatives as well. When I was writing a column for the Boston Globe, it was like all my friends were like on alert. Are you going to use this? Are you going to use? But I use everything. So certainly, I think all writers are mining their own emotional lives and histories for what they write, and they can pretend that they aren't, but that's not true. There's no way around it. Yeah.
I am an avid reader, not a writer, and I never want the books to end. If it's a good story, and it's a good character, how do you know where to end?
It's really clear when it's an end to me. I mean, I'm really looking for. I really believe in that kind of. I don't know the musical term, but there's a resolution. At the end of a symphony, it's like da-da. And Beethoven writes 20 of them at the end of one of those symphonies. But there's a resolution. There's a sort of almost a musical resolution that the hand comes off the piano keys, and that's the last note. A lot of people with this book have said, it's too short, and I want more, and I want the sequel, and that's good. I mean, leaving them wanting more is always a good thing. Beginnings and endings are really hard. Beginnings are really super hard, and endings are very hard too. But by then, at least, I sort of know what the melody is, so I know how I kind of want to do the resolution. Books that end badly are really frustrating. I mean, as a reader too, it's like, what happened? I want things. Not everything has to be tied up in neat little knots. You don't have to know it happens to everybody, but there has to be some resolution. And for me, there has to be some kind of redemption, certainly in what I write. And I prefer books that have some kind of modulated minor key major resolution. You can't be like, I don't like books that leave me completely flat. Novels, anyway, that leave me completely flat. So I don't write novels. I don't think it is not a happy book, but not everybody is flattened. At the end, life goes on.
Who are some of your favorite authors?
My favorite authors. I love MFK Fisher, who you probably never heard of. She was a food writer for The New Yorker, and she wrote beautiful, funny, smart prose. And I reread her books all the time. And I'm a big poetry fan. I read Neruda and Mary Oliver and Billy Collins and Walt Whitman and fiction. I read sort of what my friends tell me to read, like everybody else, I think. So I think the last novel I read was The Help, which is the top of the bestseller list, which I enjoyed very much. One of the books that really changed my life was 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which I read when I was in high school. I've read it many times since, and it was really new at the time, and it continues to be new. So if you haven't read that one, the other ones that one is just beautiful. This is the first one that I think it was his first novel. Like, he'd written shorter pieces, no?
No, he had a couple.
Before, that was his big success.
That was his first big success, yes.
Yeah.
The earlier stuff is very hard to read.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm glad I didn't read it, because that was, I remember it was a big success in the States too, so I read that. So I would recommend that to anybody. So yeah, it's sort of like what people hand me is what I read. People I trust is what I read. And sometimes they're wrong, and I don't like it, but often they're right. And I like reading what other people are reading at any given moment. I read my first Trollope, actually, a couple of months ago. I never read Trollope. It was one of the early novelists, and it was fun. It's hard. You had to slow down to read that sort of thing. So I'm always trying new stuff. I like to read internationally too. I like to read.
Have you read Marcus's latest piece?
Which is the latest one?
Memory of My Melancholy Quarters, I believe it was called.
Is that the autobiography?
No, not quite.
I couldn't get through the autobiography. I really couldn't get that on the big side. So no, I didn't read that one. I sort of stopped. I have to say, not in love with the latest. I read a lot for a long time and then stopped. So what do you read?
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I'm reading your book.
Yeah.
I
That's the right answer.
Whatever my book club recommends.
Yeah.
Which is,
Oh, you're in a club?
Yeah, which is good. Recommend book club style. Forces you to read, gives you deadlines.
Have any of your works been considered to be translated into movies, and is that something that you would consider? I love The Red Tent, like that could be a good movie.
It's been really interesting. The book was optioned for a few years when it first came out. It takes such a big stack of money to make a movie you can't begin to imagine, and it needs a lot of backing, and it needs a big star, and it needs on and on and on. So I'm not constitutionally opposed to the idea of it, but I dare you to think up a biblical movie that is worth sitting through. They're pretty bad. I think actually they're really bad. Can you think of one? I mean, the Ten Commandments comes right to mind, right? You seen that lately? Right. At least twice a year. People get so. I would love if someone took the Red Tent and sort of deconstructed it and made it into something filmic. And I know it's sort of cinematic, but people get too pious about the Bible, and they just worry too much. And I think that's a problem. And I really did not I didn't novelize the Bible like Thomas Mann did in the Joseph novels. He wrote like this whole series of novels. So it's not faithful to the text in a certain kind of way. And I fear that if somebody took the Red Tent and tried to make a movie out of it, they would be faithful, and that would be the kiss of death. So it would be great if somebody like Spike Jonze wanted to do it. If somebody who really wanted to take it and make it their own vision. But it's also there aren't enough explosions in it to really make it
Right.
to get the funding. So not yet. I think this book is very cinematic, actually. It's got lots of nubile young women in it. It's also got a military rescue, but we'll see if that happens.
I was a question similar to Leslie's. So I was told a long time ago that if you're reading a new book, read the last sentence.
Ouch.
And that's just read the last
sentence.
Just the sentence, and that's like a good indication of if you're probably gonna like the book or not. If you like the last sentence.
Do you do that?
I do. The last sentence of your book
Is that
great?
Oh,
It is. It's the first thing I always check.
okay.
But just wondering if you have any tidbits of advice like that.
No, I will give any book about 50 pages, but if I'm not in love with at least somebody in those 50 pages, I'll stop. At some point in the last 10 years, I just, life is too short, I'm not reading it if it doesn't really grab me, and that's included some of the, the greats, contemporary great writers, and it's just like, I don't like this writing, I don't like the style of it, and people who are very hot aren't necessarily people who's, but that's okay. I mean, there should be lots of flavors and lots of different styles, but I stop after a while.
What about nonfiction?
I read nonfiction.
Well, but they're not necessarily characters that you can like or not like.
Oh no, well if it's well written and it's compelling, and yeah, I really enjoy nonfiction. I'm reading a fair amount of history again in preparation for this book that I'm hoping to write. So and I enjoy that too. So I read, what was that last summer? I loved the Julia Child biography by her nephew. If you saw Julie and Julia, you should really read the book. It's really fun, really nice writing, really nonfiction. And I got to meet Julia Child and talk to her, so I could hear her voice. And she lived here many years ago. So that was fun. It's my last really fun nonfiction book. The rest has been history, not so much. But interesting. So that's what I'm reading. I'm up to here with his American history right now, so that's why it's hard for me to, reach out for the novels that don't come to the tip of my tongue.
You went in one of these camps, and so what happens to you in general? I mean, it seems like there are people popping up on the shore all the time. 200 people in this camp. Mm-hmm. It's going to be way too full in a day, a week, or a month. Mm-hmm. So they got to do something. They can't take them out. The boat's gone. Mm-hmm.
Well, what happened?
You eventually just let them go. They all tell the same story, basically.
They do let them go for the most part and not leave. But what happened was so many people started coming. They built an enormous camp in Cyprus. So that's if you saw the movie Exodus or read that book. That's not a great book, by the way. That's a terrible book. It was a better movie than a book, actually. They took the dramatic part of it. And they built this enormous internment camp in Cyprus, and people were there for years. And it was hot and miserable, and for all of that, there were there were many marriages, many children born. People taught school to the children, they taught music to the children, so they made life happen in this incredibly hot, miserable place. So that's what happened with a lot of them. I mean, it was a relatively porous border, you had this whole coastline, so a lot of people did get in and...
I mean, like maybe they catch 1 in 3 or something.
Right. So the people who were in camp, in at least some of them actually wound up having family, so they got released to family. If they were sick, they got sent to hospitals. Children, in particular, if they were orphans, would get sent to orphanages. So the British were a real mixed bag as occupiers. They were both compassionate and jerks. I mean, and it depended on the individual as much as anything else. But they were, I remember Baruch, who gave this tour, talking about, he said, if your prison camp is going to be run by anybody, you want the British, because they believe in rules.
So the Germans.
Well, in a different, but they also believe in the Geneva Conventions, and that these were not prisoners; these were in fact internees, and they knew that they were, and there was a lot of guilt among some of the British as well. They were not all happy about being put in these positions. So there were anti-Semites who were very happy about being put in this position. So they were just human beings. So in ultimately an impossible situation, as it still is to this very day.
So this seems like actually the British's fig leaf. They've made some treaty or something and promised that they would stop immigration.
Right.
Clearly they can't.
They can't,
and
exactly.
Clearly they can't shoot you at the water's edge, or they're not prepared to.
They're not prepared to, and at the same time they had to keep the Arab population.
Right.
And say we are enforcing this quota system.
They're making some show
yes.
of doing their best.
Right. They did their, and then they opened Cyprus, which really was this big holding camp, which became an international embarrassment as well, because it was people got sick there and people did die there. It was
so
a
many
tough
people
place
in
to
squalor.
Yeah. Too many
and you
people.
can't park them there forever.
Right, exactly. But they were there, it felt like forever. They were there for years.
Right.
People were there for weeks or months. In Cyprus, they were stuck for a long time, and it was an island. It was hard to escape.
Well, whenever I think of that, it just reminds me of our own southern border. There are people trying to sneak across in the dark of night, hope of a better life, a community up here if they can make it, but that they can thread right into, and in some fraction they catch. Of course, we're not we're not shooting them at the water's edge either.
We're not sure.
But
And we're-
neither do we make it pleasant enough that they're excited about. I suspect actually that 9 out of 10 make it clean and clear over time. That's what
Probably,
the coyotes
although
do.
fewer now because the economy's so bad, but.
Snakeheads or whatever.
But yeah, no, I think this is sort of an international classic story about trying to get into a place that you're sort of not legally supposed to be part of. But, and the world is more porous than it's ever been before. Or borders anyway, more porous, no matter what we try.
We're just about at time. Thank you so much for coming.
You're
This was
welcome.
wonderful.
Thank you.